Hi, I'm Nicole.
And I'm Robin. And today on Books That Burn, we have a guest that we are interviewing. Would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sara Codair. My pronouns are they, them.
Excellent. Can you tell us a little bit about the books we're discussing today?
So we have Power Surge is the first one in the series. That's a young adult urban fantasy about a teenager who finds himself drawn into the world of demon hunting. And then there's the second book in the series, Power Inversion, which is once Aaron is immersed in that world already, their partner gets kidnapped by a demon and they're on a rescue mission to save him. There's also a prequel novella called Life Minus Me that's one of the side characters on her own little side quest.
All right. And then can you talk a little bit about the way trauma works in your writing?
All right. That's changed a little bit over the years, but in the series we're talking about today, I guess there's a lot of trauma. And it's a lot of, some of it's part of the character's backstory, and then some of it happens in the book. And, you know, some of it is like catalyst for change for the characters to happen. Some of it's tied to the plot. Some of it I put in there because I think it's things that I've gone through that other people might find helpful to see on the page. Some of it's stuff that just kind of, you know, came out of nowhere, but worked with the plot. I tend to be a pantser, so not everything is planned. So some things kind of come up and catch me off guard, and, you know, I run with them. Other times I go back and take them out.
So, piggybacking a little bit off of that concept of, like, sometimes you've got a plan and sometimes you don't. I kind of feel like I know where your answer is going to go on this, but for our audience sake, do you feel that trauma for the sake of trauma is valid for characters to go through, or does it always need to be plot related?
I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by trauma for the sake of trauma, because I don't feel like authors should go and make bad things happen to their characters just for the sake of torturing their characters. But
that is what we're talking about.
Okay.
There are authors, and I will say storytellers, it's not always books, who just put things in the narrative for the sake of shock value, or just to serve as a plot twist, or to force a character to have to deal with it, and it could very easily just not even appear, and nothing negative would change, you know, like.
Yeah,
that's usually
really the contrast that we're kind of after.
Those are usually the books where a trigger warning and a spoiler feel like the same thing, and if they feel like the same thing, you might not be taking care of your reader.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I try to I don't, like, it either has a purpose for the plot or a purpose for the character arc, or I'm trying to incorporate it because it's something that, like, I feel like needs representation maybe in books, but I don't do it just for the sake of, like, shock value or making, you know, because I want to make something bad happen.
Right. Have you ever started writing a trauma in one of your books and had it take over or have more of a story impact than intended? Or alternatively, have something just not have less of an impact than you intended?
I think with, I've definitely found that some little piece of backstory that I thought wasn't going to be as significant actually ends up really shaping who our character is and how they interact in the story. I think that kind of happened with Power Surge. There's also, I just lost where I was going with this. There's also been times where I didn't plan to write something and then it just, you know, showed up. In times where I've put things in and then ended up just taking them out because they didn't actually fit.
Yeah.
So a little bit of both. Okay. A little bit of both, I guess.
Kind of. So staying in the same vein, you have kind of, I don't want to say a lot of background characters, but your background characters in your series don't feel inconsequential. they're not really replaceable.
Yeah.
Do you ever write in trauma for those background characters without planning for it to have an impact on the story? And if so, does it ever kind of leak into the story?
So I have a lot of background for the characters in this series, and maybe it's like what you see on the page is like the tip of the iceberg.
Okay.
I could write in the series forever, but yeah, it does seep in because, like, for example, in Evanstar Chronicles, like Erin's aunt Lucy is only like in very small amounts of the story, but she's lost her brother who was Erin's father. She's had a severe injury hunting demons, and those are pieces of her backstory, but even like the little time she's on the page, they influence who she is, how she acts, how she interacts with other characters. Where like Erin's father, he's never been in the book, he's been dead for a long time, but like that, like the trauma from that death kind of interacts with almost every character in that family in some way. And when I came up with the backstory for that book, like I hadn't quite realized, like I just was like, okay, this character is, has their mother, but their father passed away, and then it just spiraled into this like, thing that changed this family and drastically, and it's on the page a little bit, but there's so much like backstory of it in my head, and it had just been like a little detail that came out of nowhere 10 years ago or actually it's more than 10 years ago now that I just started Power Surge, and became a defining thing for the family.
Mm-hmm.
And
that makes sense. That's definitely one of those where reading it, I kind of had this feeling of like it being such a pervasive, like non delved into thing, like that very much carries through in the writing.
Yep.
So pivoting away from trauma for a moment, we'll come back to that. We have more questions, but
okay.
So other things that affect characters, other kinds of backstory for them. What is your approach to incorporating visible characters of color in your work? What do you do to make it go beyond social coding or not?
So this is one thing that I guess has changed over time. When I started writing, I was more naive and less aware of like my own privilege and how that influenced things. And I'm a lot more careful now. But what I try to, like, one like little thing I try to do is every character I try to describe like their skin tone, so it's no like default white. And that was something that I learned from my critique group. I honestly don't know how good I am at the social coding part of it, and that's an area I definitely need to improve in. I know with the Evanstar Chronicles, part of like, I know one of the characters of color is Neben the elf, and honestly part of where that came out is I was like, every elf in like Lord of the Rings and these high fantasy things are white. Like I need to have, just to kind of go against that, right, that I need to have elves that aren't all white. But then because, like the elves and fairy culture is completely different from human culture, there's not necessarily maybe the kind of social coding that there should be. And I've been thinking about this a lot, and I don't know that, I have a lot of unanswered questions about like how I handled it, in my early books, and if I should kind of try to adjust anything as the series goes on, but then the series is already, I feel like some things are already set in stone, so it's more like, how can I do better in my future books?
Mm-hmm. I mean, copying real-world racism into elf culture, that doesn't seem like a solution to me, so yeah, no. That's definitely tricky.
Yeah, because I didn't, like in my head the whole, like I have this whole culture planned out and like for elves and stuff, and it doesn't have the same racism that the real world has, but then, and I feel like as a white person I couldn't necessarily really understand what that racism is like, so it would be hard to kind of find a parallel for it, but then I don't want to feel like I'm erasing anything either, so it's, it's a tricky subject, and I still have a lot of learning that I need to do.
Yeah. So then to some things that we can tell you definitely incorporated. For queerness, do you tend to write characters with a specific orientation? Do you generally stick to depictions of queerness which match parts of your identity?
With my main characters and then side characters that have a significant role in the story, I do. I tend to write, like, you'll see a lot of, like, bi or pan characters in my stories. And less characters that are just lesbians or something, or just gay. Because I'm never sure if, like, bi or pan fits better, but because, that's my label, then I kind of default to that for a lot of characters. And then as I've kind of exploring my identity more, I've been writing more demi and ace spectrum characters. But sometimes with a side character that, like, I will, venture into different identities if it's not, if I'm not writing from that person's point of view. Like in my...
1 second,
Oh, go ahead.
Who has a hammer in their background?
A what?
Someone is hammering in someone's background.
That's me. I'm, like, as far away from that as I can possibly get.
Okay. All right. So, Nicole, you're going to be able to edit that out? Okay, cool. All right.
Yeah, sorry. I went upstairs because downstairs it was too loud, but I can still hear it up here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Sorry for that. Okay. All right. So, sorry, did you have more about depictions of queerness?
No, I can. I just totally went blank. So can you kind of prompt me back to where we were?
So you're saying that with whether you stick to depictions of queerness which match parts of your identity, you were talking about bi and pan characters.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And so if it's a character that, I'm writing from that character's point of view, I do try to stay in my own lane more. But when they're side characters, then I still tend to write a lot more characters that have something in common with my identity, but I'll write different queer identities if I'm not writing from, like, that point of view strictly. And as far as gender goes, I do write a lot of non-binary characters, but if a character's not non-binary, then they tend to be my assigned gender because, for the first, 28 years of my life, I lived that assigned gender, so I still feel like I can rate that.
That makes sense.
But so most of my characters tend to either be non-binary or they tend to be female, if it's from their point of view.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So this is something that I always find really, really interesting. And just what people choose and how they choose to depict things in fictional settings. What, if any, do you think is a good example of queer culture in your books? And it doesn't have to be something that directly parallels the real world, but is there anything in your books that is explicitly queer culture?
That is a really good question. And I'm not sure how to answer it because I feel like I've been kind of isolated from queer culture for, like, I don't always recognize when I'm putting it in my writing or not. I really in general don't have a big social life in real life, so I'm not 100% sure I'm sure it's there, it's just something I always struggle with because I'm not really off of Twitter and off of Discord servers and online spaces. In real life, I don't really have a queer community that I'm part of. So I'm never quite certain, like, I rate, from my own lens, but sometimes I'm just not certain if there is I don't know. But I guess, there is a mix of, I found family is something that I feel like comes up a lot in queer books, and in mine there tends to be a mix of, when I talk about, the Evan stars, there's the ones that are literally related to each other, like Erin and their grandfather and their cousin Mel, but then there's also, Sister Marie and Karen and, Jose and these other characters that aren't related biologically, but they're all just as much family. So I think that would be one example, and then having characters that maybe don't make the same assumptions about people's genders and identity that like a cishet character would. Maybe would be another example. I'm trying to be like very deliberate about, even the characters that are cis, not, like they're still asking people's pronouns and not just like assuming things based on people's appearances.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then for kind of our third aspect of character creation that we ask people about, have you ever had a character surprise you with a disability after you started writing?
I can think of 2 instances of this kind of I'm writing a book from Mel's point of view right now that's outside of the series, but still some of the same characters. And, in the main Evan Star Chronicles book, like, you would, see her healing people when maybe she shouldn't have.
We'll get into that.
When she didn't really have enough energy to heal someone, she'd do it anyways. And when I started writing a longer book from her point of view, figuring out why, I mean, like, it's a mental illness thing. It has to do with, it's like a compulsion and an addiction. So I guess I don't know if that would really, maybe that falls into a slightly different category, but when I was just writing Mel as a side character, I hadn't quite, like, didn't really delve into, like, how tied in it was to her mental health, I guess. And when I started writing from her point of view, I was like, oh, this is why she's always healing people when she shouldn't.
I mean, if depression and anxiety count as disabilities, then whatever you want to label that as sounds like it. Yeah.
Yeah, or addiction would. So, so that was a surprise. And even when I was creating Erin, I mean, Erin is a character that evolved over a decade, because I started writing Power Surge when I was a freshman in college in 2007. It got published in 2018. And so Erin kind of stayed with me through, like, acknowledging my own depression, getting diagnosed with ADHD. And so some things about their character I wrote, and it was clear that it was, they were depressed, that they did have ADHD. But when I first started writing it, I wasn't, like, I was writing these things, but I didn't necessarily know exactly what they were. And as, I left the book alone for a while, came back to it, I was like, yep, okay, we both have this disability. It's like, and then, then I tried to make it more explicit and revised how I portrayed it. But in the very first, earlier drafts, I wasn't, I wasn't necessarily planning it, but it was showing up because I was kind of writing Erin through how I experienced certain things. And so that in some ways was kind of a surprise too, but it evolved so much over such a long period of time that by the time, it was getting into its final complete stages, it was very deliberate.
Okay. And then, do you consider your character's physical description when you're writing how other characters treat them?
Especially concerning visible disabilities, too.
Yeah.
Especially concerning what?
Disability. Visible disabilities?
Oh, visible disabilities. Yeah. I mean, most of my characters' disabilities are invisible, with the exception of Lucy, who has very little time on the page, I guess. So in terms of disability, it's not thought of a whole lot because you can't really, a majority of the characters, you can't see their disability. Like most of it.
I mean, in even things like body type or any signs of visible neurodivergence or, and even things like that.
Okay, so thinking about it that way, then it did affect how I wrote the way, say, Erin's grandfather treated them or looked at them. Like, Erin's grandfather treated Erin and Mel very differently, and Erin's neurodiverse, Mel's not. So Erin's grandfather was a little bit more protective of them, and it was probably unnecessary because Erin is actually very tough and resilient and strong, but there was a little bit of, I guess, ableism in some of the older characters in the way they treated Erin.
Yeah, I think I want to circle back to this in the spoiler-filled section because I have a very specific question about the grandfather and how he treated Erin.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm going to ask you
I
this
definitely
again.
come back to that in the spoiler section.
So, we still have a couple questions before we move on to that section.
Okay.
Is there? So I'm going to kind of take two of our questions and put them in. I feel like they might either be related or one kind of takes more precedence than the other in your writing.
Okay.
So how does setting influence culture in your series? And what, if any, do you think is a good example of a marginalized culture in your writing?
So, I mean, it's mostly a contemporary setting.
But I will throw this out there. You do have at least references to angels and elves and demons, and in at least from reading it, it seems like they even have kind of their own cultures as well, even if it's not something that's like directly entangled with in the story.
Yeah. I guess so. From that sense, the little bits of the book that cross over into fairy, the setting does show that there is a different culture there with like the brief interactions with Erin's grandmother and great grandmother together. Like that conversation is very different than a conversation with, say, Erin's grandfather in the regular world, because there is this, that's a place where people are. Elves are living thousands of years. I have this whole, like, social and political, world created in fairy, and I don't know if I'll ever get to write about it. I could,
honestly, if you do, I want to read about it.
I could go on a tangent about that because there's, like, different, I guess I could say countries, or nations, but the one that Erin's grandmother and great-grandmother are part of, the great-grandmother's kind of like, has been ruling it for thousands of years, but she's kind of hands-off with it, and it almost has sort of a socialist democratic system of, there's not really, like, private-owned land, like, everybody has access to food and healthcare, and things are voted on, but then there's also kind of lurking in the distance. There is this one, ruler that could at any time come and take control back of everything, but allows it to kind of function in a more socialist and democratic way. And part of me would love to write a book like just set in this world and really like dig into that whole culture. But it's
just like democratic socialism with a magical banhammer, kind of.
Yes. Yeah, and I would, maybe someday I'll write like a short story or another book, just with characters and fairy that's completely set aside from it because I created that whole thing, mapped out, and it would be fascinating, because there are lots of good things about it, but then there'd also be problems too.
Yeah.
So, right.
Oh man. I would in a heartbeat read just like 20 short stories, slice of life, one chapter per character or setting or whatever, like of all of that culture that just shows all the ways that it interacts. Like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Like that was definitely something reading your books. I was like, I want to know more about this.
Yeah.
Because there's things that impact Mel and impact Erin even when they don't know about him yet. And like, it was one of those things that reading it as a reader, I was like, oh man, just on the edge of where I'm allowed to know about it. There's this thing, and it seems so rich. It seems such a good complex tapestry. It has rules and it has things, and I don't know what they are. Like,
No, there's only so much I can fit.
So yeah, I would read that in a heartbeat if you ever write it.
I wrote it's not in the same world, but I've been fascinated when I think of like world building of how sort of socialism kind of interacts with different kind of governments. So I had written a short story in an anthology, which actually is out of print now, where it was sort of a feudal society, but there was one character that everyone was trying to kill because she was trying to implement more socialist policies in her kingdom or queendom. And it was told from the point of view of like her sister, her sibling, who was trying to protect her from all these assassins, but that's out of print now. But yeah, no, someday I might have to delve more into maybe even in book 3 I'll be able to fit a little bit more in. So I still have one more book in the trilogy.
Oh, okay, so it is planned as a trilogy, but then with like attached books.
Yeah, because there's a trilogy, basically a trilogy from Erin's point of view, that is their character arc, and they're them trying to stop this like apocalypse that's coming. And that's the arc of the trilogy. But I can't stop writing these characters, so like like Mel and Mike. Mel has a pretty significant side character, but Mike is just like one of those little ones on the fringes that has this whole complicated backstory too. So I'm writing a college paranormal romance about how Mel and Mike met, and Mel actually ends up in this sort of love square where she's choosing between like a poly relationship with these two girls she meets at college, and then Mike. And obviously anyone who reads Evanstar Chronicles is going to know how it ends, but so it's been kind of an interesting challenge trying to like knowing how it ends to try to really write it so that new readers really wouldn't know who she's going to pick.
Right.
Oh yeah, there's not this well, of course, inevitable
thread. So people
doing justice to both options.
Yeah, I really need it's been a challenge to try to do justice to them, because in my head, like, I know how who she's gonna end up with, and I hadn't planned to make it a love triangle or square, but then these other characters just kind of popped up when I was writing, and I was like, it would be easier to take them out, but I'm like, but I really like them. And I guess there's still a chance that if I don't pull it off, they couldn't pull off the triangle, I could end up taking them out, but I'm trying really hard to keep them in.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I do like that. Just something I'm like thinking about as you're talking about that. I really appreciate that character identities are more nuanced than just I am bi and I have a partner. Or I am poly and that's the only thing I have and that's the only thing I've ever wanted. Like a character making a choice between two vastly different relationship dynamics.
Yes.
That's not always something that you just see in like there's and I'm not, and like I'm just, this is just something I don't think I've thought about this before. Like I'm just thinking about it now. Like there's a lot of times where you'll have a character that's like, oh, am I or am I not? But it's never, I know who I am, and there's more than one option available to me.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, it does. And there is a lot of like Mel questioning her identity and sexuality in this book. Kind of figuring out that she's demisexual. The two girls that she could possibly choose are both allo. Mike is Grey Ace, and that's a detail about his identity that never came up in the trilogy because he's such like a minor character. So it's like a really complicated thing, and there's even like more layers to it because he kind of almost knows about the supernatural in the beginning, and part of how she meets him is because he's working with these paranormal investigators, but he has no clue what kind of supernatural stuff he's really getting into. And almost gets himself killed a few times, where the two girls know nothing at all about the supernatural, and it's kind of like a place where Mill feels like she can be human, she can have sort of a normal life, and keep the fact that she's not entirely human and keep her supernatural life separate. So it adds a layer to the choice, like, do I want a relationship that might eventually lead to a person getting pulled into the world of demon hunting, or one that's going to keep everything, my romantic life separate from, my family's, like, dark secrets and stuff.
Uh-huh.
So it's a very, it's a complicated story. But it's fun.
Yeah,
it's fun
that sounds like it'd be really cool to read, but also I hear that and I'm like, oh, I'm so glad she ended up with Mike and that we already know that, because
yep.
Otherwise, I mean, or you could, if it had gone instead that she ended up with the two girls, you could then have, like, the follow-up of how many years later when, like, they find out about the demon stuff, because, like, that's a lot to keep secret.
Yeah.
And I'm always in favor of fewer secrets, please.
Yeah. As I'm, like, rewriting the end, I'm toying with the idea of them actually maybe not finding out the whole truth, but, learning some of it.
Mm.
The book is very much...
And the reaction is...
Yeah, the book is very much still in progress, so...
Uh-huh.
Anything could happen with it still.
So I think I have one last question for the spoiler-free zone.
Okay.
For our audience at home, please discuss how and whether you use queer inclusive language in your writing.
Okay, queer inclusive language.
Even something like the main character is non-binary and they talk about that. Like, that's a kind of queer inclusivity.
So I do try to do a lot of that. Sometimes, like, my dog is barking. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Your dog is a welcome guest.
I think he stopped. Okay. So, yeah, like, sometimes, even if it's not directly relevant to the plot, I try to find a moment where someone might naturally think about something like that. So, like, with Erin, it was easy because they experienced a lot of dysphoria about certain things. So there are moments when, I would feel something would happen and I would feel dysphoria about it and I would think about it. So if Erin was in a situation like that, then, getting, even something as simple as, like, getting dressed to go out or something, like, do I put a binder on or not? So there's things like that, are easier to do, but then, like, in the prequel novella Life Minus Me, I wanted to somehow bring up, acknowledge that Mel is Demi, but there's no romance or anything, so, I mean, in some ways her sexuality wasn't really relevant to the plot, but I still found a moment where it was kind of a quieter moment in the book where she was thinking about something and it just, kind of came up in thought, because I wanted to make it clear to readers that, this is who she is. And, sometimes with characters that are questioning, then there's also plenty of time for the character to think, well, am I this identity, or is this one a better label? In the beginning of Power Surge, like, the non-binary coding, I think there were a few times where Erin labeled themselves as that, but there hadn't really been anything explicitly saying, oh, Erin is bi or pan or something, because Erin really doesn't know at that point. And, Erin has so much, like, other things going on that they really, at that point, hadn't really had time to really self-reflect and think. And in the beginning of Power Inversion, there's, like, this moment where, they've worked past certain traumas and are thinking, okay, well, maybe I might even be on the A spectrum, but then, of course, so much else happens that they don't have time to think about it again. So I'm hoping to explore it more in book 3 once I'm hoping book 3 is probably not going to be quite as fast-paced as book 2, but a little bit more action than book 1. So somewhere in between the two. Which might give a little bit more time for Aaron to kind of figure things out.
Yeah.
Did I answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So we're gonna bring this to a close with a couple last wrap-up questions. These are all, great, positive things. Thank you so much for talking about all the dark stuff in the books. What is your favorite non-traumatic thing in any of your books?
Pizza? All the food? The bacon?
Okay.
I mean, there's a lot of, food-related joy in these books with, the bacon, the waffles,
the
all the pizza,
even your descriptions of, the dogs enjoying doggy treats, I feel like might even fall under that.
The dogs, too, yeah, I mean, and even Bessie is probably one of my and then in the novella there are so many dogs, and so yeah, the dogs are definitely dogs, the food,
I'm a cat person. So when I read the novella, I was like, oh, dog person, cool. I'm appreciating these. I like dogs in theory, but in practice, they lick my face.
I love other people's dogs. I'm more low maintenance than most dogs I know, and I don't have the energy to expend that on another creature if I don't on myself. My cats I can feed and give them the litter, change their litter and give them water, and they curl up with me and they're cool. That's different. But I did really, really enjoy your dog depictions. And
if for the audience, I can confirm that the dogs are definitely a very happy, non-traumatic thing.
Oh, they're wonderful.
Yes.
And
the food. Depending also, I love the coffee shop descriptions in general.
Yep.
Depending on how the audio gets edited, the audience may also have gotten to hear Sarah's dog in this.
Sorry, I realized we asked you what your favorite non-traumatic thing was, and then immediately we're like, "Oh yeah, us too."
It's so good.
Sorry,
I don't know. The dogs probably are my favorite over the pizza, but my head is this morning I was working on the Mel romance novel, and the dogs really aren't in that book. Bessie has a cameo in it, as she's only a puppy, and she's adorable. But in that book, the dogs weren't there, and there is so much pizza in that book, and I'm hungry.
Okay. Oh.
But the dogs probably are not probably, the dogs are better.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite book written by someone else? And if so, what makes it your favorite?
I have too many favorite books, but I recently have really, really enjoyed, was it Once and Future and Sword in the Stars? And there is just so much I don't know. Even though there are struggles in those books, it was just this adventure in space and time with swords and knights, and I don't know, there's something about it that was just this escape. And
yeah.
That was one of, my favorite books I've read in the past year or two. There's other favorites, but that one was really, a good escape. And then, go ahead.
And for the audience, that's Once and Future by Amy Rose Capetta and Corey McCarthy.
Yes.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, it's on the TBR.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. I'm glad we're also already aware of this series.
Yeah, we're up on that. I just have a very deep TBR, which is actually how we met. Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting to read those. I just have to decide that they are the priority on the to read pile at some point. Do you have any queer authors and or authors of color whose work you'd like to shout out?
Yeah, so let me try to read my own handwriting. So, The Black Veins by Asia Monet, I really enjoyed that. And that was a queer author of color. And then I don't usually read a lot of contemporary, but I read You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson, and usually I don't like contemporary if there's no fantasy element, but that book just, like, it made me laugh, it made me cry, but it was, like, happy crying, and I got so immersed in the story of it, even though it wasn't my usual genre, that I feel like that needs a shout out. And then Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas was also really good.
Mm-hmm. I am waiting for my copy to arrive in the mail.
I had read it on NetGalley, so I read it a while ago, but then I ended up, there's a 14-year-old in my neighborhood that had a birthday recently, and I ended up buying her a copy. That, and then Once and Future. So, because, I was like, I already read it, like, I could read it again, I want to support the author, then I thought of that neighbor, and I was like, I'm going to buy it for that person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we're very happy to have you and talk about your books. Again, those books are Life Minus Me, Power Surge, and Power Inversion. And what order do you recommend reading those in?
So, based on what I've seen from reviewers, a lot of people said that they actually wished that people who read Life Minus Me first said they actually wished they waited till after they read Power Surge to read it. I've seen that come up chronologically. Life Minus Me happens first, but the order I wrote it in was Power Surge, Life Minus Me, Power Inversion. So you could read it either way, but I've seen multiple reviews that said they wish they hadn't read Life Minus Me first, that it would have been better to have read it in between the two novels. So even though originally I was recommending reading it chronologically, now I'm wondering if I should actually be recommending it in the middle.
Well, as someone who read Life Minus Me first, I agree with those those comments.
Reviewers? Okay.
Yeah, because I started Power Surge, and there was just a little bit of disorientation of like, wait, hold on. Like,
yeah.
Some of this feels like I know things I shouldn't, or I'm like, so I definitely would like to back those people up.
Yeah.
And it gives a little bit of a tone break in between Power Surge and Power Inversion.
Yeah.
Like getting to see Mel's side of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that in hindsight that makes more sense to read it that way, because then you already know all about the world, and
right.
And now you're getting to just see it from a different point of view.
Mm-hmm. So, thank you so much for joining us, and for our regular audience, or can you, sorry, I was thinking of scheduling things. Where can our audience find you and your books?
Let's see, on Twitter and Instagram I'm at Shattered Smooth. My website is saracodair.com. You can find my books on Amazon, Barnes & Noble's website, 9starpress.com. Most book retailers should have it. Small bookstores don't usually carry it, but they can usually order it. And on Facebook, if you were to use Shattered Smooth, it would actually take you to my old jewelry Facebook page. So it's Facebook.com/SaraCodair1 to get to my author Facebook page.
All right. So thank you so much for joining us. And you can find us. We're Books That Burn pretty much everywhere. So Books That Burn on Instagram and Twitter. And then also we have a link tree that you can use to find everything. So that's linktr.ee/Books That Burn. You can use that to find our reviews, our transcripts, the podcast, our monthly Q&As are on the YouTube channel. So check us out. And if sounds like you'd want to read this book, so I hope that you'll check out Life Minus Me, Power Surge, and Power Inversion. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.